Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody. That is hopefully for somebody. My name is Kyle Naranya, and on episode 128, I am going to be reviewing and discussing the first two episodes of Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man. What once was freshman year of Spider-Man that had some Tom Holland connectivity no longer does. We now have an entirely new show exploring its own version of the Marvel Universe. I'm looking forward to discussing it because this is a TV quote-unquote review. If you haven't seen the first two episodes, there will be spoilers for both of those and some speculation as to where it's going to go. So if you haven't watched them yet, you have been warned, but time codes for each segment of the episode will be listed in the description, so there's no need to worry if you want to hop around. Let's jump into Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man.
High school orientation. How excited are you?
Honestly, I'm still waiting for them to tell me they sent the approval letter to the wrong Peter Parker. But I've wanted to go to Midtown for years. Their robotics program is supposed to be one of the best in the country.
And here I thought you were excited about learning.
Unfortunately, the first thing to address, and it's been commented on by the showrunner because of comments made by Hudson Thames, the actor who was playing Peter Parker / Spider-Man in Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man. It's quite disappointing, honestly. I'm sure it took the wind out of the sails of anybody marketing with this. But while speaking to Collider, Hudson said, "I thought it was awesome. And I mean, my biggest fear was that it was going to be annoying and woke. And it wasn't," Thames said. "I said, yeah, this is great. It's so well written, like it feels real. I'm the oldest of 5 boys, so I feel like I kind of know what's happening in their lives and in high school, and it felt like doing that justice." Now, unfortunately, in the current climate, woke seems to be used as a comment on the negative quality of DEI being involved in creative representation or any other structure in society, whether that be corporate, financial, any of those aptitude or areas of exploration. And unfortunately, I find this especially disappointing, particularly with Spider-Man in general and a lot of these characters. And there has been backlash throughout the modern run of superhero adaptations, specifically with the live action ones more than anything, which seems to get the most vitriolic reaction, which is the diversification of these comic book universes that were created in the 60s. And don't get me wrong, there are versions of these universes in their early interpretation that added diversity and had a more of a modern reflection on specifically the United States of America. Spider-Man is one where, for the most part, the cast in the comic book creation was not very diverse. Now, that has been changed slowly. Spectacular Spider-Man, one of my favorites, did add a substantial amount of diversity, but not to any of the main leads. And of course, the elephant in the room in addressing this comment of woke is super frustrating, just used as a term of something that is forcing in diversity, where representation is a really important thing, particularly in multicultural societies. The creation of Miles Morales, a half Latinx, half African American character, to show the power of Spider-Man and the symbolism of that mask. And they've made 2 films on this with Miles Morales, particularly with Into the Spider-Verse, that anyone can be the hero. That because Spider-Man, his ethnicity is hidden from those he saves, you can put yourself in the shoes or mask or costume of that person and see greatness that is possible. Spider-Man's main character outside of Peter Parker is Miles Morales. He had his own video game recently, and then he was a main character in Spider-Man 2. Diversity has become an integral part of the Spider-Man world, particularly where it takes place in New York City, one of the most cosmopolitan places on planet Earth. So if you are making a show that is supposed to be a representation of an adjacent Marvel Cinematic Universe, of course, there's going to be diversity. And if that includes people of different races, different sexual preferences, different religions, that's great, because if we are trying to make a show that is reflective of the world we live in now, Those things should just be a part of it, so it is a fair representation of the place the show is taking in. Regardless on whether Hudson misspoke or not, the use of that term to describe it being forced on somebody for the sake of saying it, Hudson is a white American, and that I'm really disappointed for however it did come out based on what people were thinking leading up to this show. We have already seen the diversification of some of the main characters, that particularly with the Osborns, which we'll get into as I talk about the show, and having the showrunner say he assumes that he likely misspoke when just talking about the interpretation of the show and the diversity in it. It is really annoying that as somebody who is biracial, I feel like I have to talk about this because I should probably be frank. The marketing for this was really interesting to me, particularly with what this show was originally pitched, and the fault is on mine for not keeping up with the massive pivot that clearly was done in the creative and pre-production leading to the making of this show. Now, let's actually get into the show because that's actually what people want to hear me talk about. They don't want a 7-minute rant on what I just did. So let's get into Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man. I'm totally surprised by a mix of my feelings, and some of them are probably going to be more critical than I necessarily want to be. The first is it's a cartoon. We are used to a substantial amount of different visual styles for Spider-Man cartoons. We've had traditional 2D animation, we have had CG animation, and this trend in the industry to sort of have this hybrid, cel-shaded, three-dimensional character design is becoming more prevalent in the industry. More recently, this was done with the animated adaptation of Watchmen Chapter 1 and 2 from Warner Brothers Home Video. And what I really appreciate about the attempt to do this is when making an animated show, particularly one with CGI models, moving them through three-dimensional space when you're having somebody like Peter Parker swinging as Spider-Man, that makes the maneuverability with those objects substantially easier than some poor soul having to animate those things over and over and over again, particularly when trying to make the movement seem realistic or at least plausible with the character model that has been designed and not breaking the laws of physics. That's really cool, and this had been used to some degree if you go all the way back to the animated series from the 90s, where the environments that they put Peter Parker in were computer generated. Now, they did not match at all with the art style of that show because Spider-Man the Animated Series was, of course, a 2D animated project outside of the opening titles and some of the three-dimensional backgrounds that were used for that. This show certainly takes a lot of visual cues from the early Spider-Man era, particularly with a lot of the character designs. They look very much inspired by Steve Ditko and John Romita Sr. models for a lot of these characters. Of course, some changes have been done to more modernize them. I've already mentioned this, but the Osborns are now African Americans, so there are slight changes in that to make them a more faithful representation of an African American in 2025. I appreciate particularly with Peter's designs really going for that color palette that looks like Peter Parker from Amazing Fantasy 15. That's something that I really liked. For the most part, I felt that the action in this show works really great. Obviously, I said why the three-dimensional models would work better in creating an action sequence, and they do really do that well. Seeing these characters, obvious with Spider-Man, move through the city and Midtown, getting real web swinging from Peter Parker at this era, which is more akin to something we saw in the other interpretations of Spider-Man. It's not really something we saw a lot from Peter Parker. He didn't web swing a lot, and they held off really doing that until Spider-Man No Way Home, this being a new version. And it really does differentiate itself. If you're a fan of Spider-Man in general, this may be an interesting point for you to start watching this show. I know a lot of people might be watching this thinking about all of the MCU isms that are going to be a part of it. And what I really appreciate about them doing that for this show is this really reminded me of the Batman The Adventures Continue, which was a comic book that came out recently where it continued the story of the New Adventures of Batman, which in itself was a continuation of Batman the Animated Series, as if Batman Beyond, Justice League, and Justice League Unlimited had never happened. They told a story filling out that universe, not concerning itself with the further continuity. And this came forward in the production for Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, where when it was obviously announced, it was Spider-Man freshman year and was going to address things we hadn't seen from Peter Parker prior to Civil War and Spider-Man Homecoming. Obviously, that's not what happened, and they took the adjacent standpoint where, what if we change some distinct events in Peter's life, and then we get our own version of the Marvel Cinematic Universe without being beholden to what has happened already or what could not have happened because of the way that they use the characters. From a purely creative standpoint, I found this really entertaining. All the voice acting in this is really great, capturing what feels like youth of this era, not feeling like adults doing kids' voices, which is a tendency that can happen sometimes when, for one, the writing's not great and the actor, from a pitch standpoint, doesn't necessarily fit in with what they're trying to do for those characters. But the whole cast all the way through works really well. I appreciate that, particularly sticking with the young Peter Parker. He is a freshman still in high school, really stands out for this. Now, does it sound distinct from anybody else? No. Does it sound like a young Tom Holland? No. And because the show is its own universe, I appreciate that they're doing that. Carrie Walgreen as May Parker is interesting enough. We don't get a ton of that interaction. Now, we do know certain things have happened similarly to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but everybody all the way through seems to capture the tone of what this show's going through, which is a modernization of the 60s eras of the comics, which is really fun because to me it felt reminiscent as well as the original Spider-Man film from 2002 with Tobey Maguire. Capturing that feel of the 60s without having that, oh, gee willikers, Adam West-ness about it can be a really razor wire to manage and walk on. And I think that the show really does manage to capture that, where they do give us the origin of Peter's spider bite, but automatically, because this is the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and this series, unlike a lot of other Spider-Man shows, Spectacular Spider-Man, Spider-Man The New Adventures, Spider-Man Unlimited, and that it wasn't until Ultimate Spider-Man and Marvel Spider-Man, or Spider-Man the Animated Series, there were some rights issues in the eras that those shows were being made, where you couldn't use the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Marvel Comics universe, and getting Doctor Strange to immediately show up and be a part of this story. And the first two episodes really establishing what makes this universe its own without feeling like it's just a shadow of the Marvel Cinematic Universe in a bad way. I like the elements of using things we're familiar with, particularly that of Peter's world in Queens, having the very first shot of the show be Queens, New York, and getting to see Peter leading up to the events of meeting Norman Osborn, that replacing the event of when Peter met Tony in Captain America Civil War, even having the same left-hand free play, which I really appreciated, and following the exact choreography and camera movement of that scene made it really cool. Now, I've talked a lot of positives about a lot of this show. I think the character designs for the show are great as 2D images. One of the elements that I don't think has helped with modern CGI, and it's interesting because Spider-Man has done this before, where with Spider-Man The New Adventures, which was actually sort of supposed to be connected to the Tobey Maguire movies, it's really interesting that Spider-Man has kind of done this already, but this is a whole different thing because Spider-Man 2 negated the events of Spider-Man The New Adventures because of what happened in that film. But Spider-Man The New Adventures was a CGI animated show, but it didn't attempt to have any 2D layers. This show, from the art design, sometimes the models feel like they're moving quite slow and they haven't fully rendered in, matching that fully 24 frames per second. I was trying to watch intently to see if that was the case. In traditional 2D animation, typically characters move in 12 frames per second, which means every other frame for 24 frames, which is usually what we're watching our film and TV on. That's what a character's moving in. If you're a deep film cinephile and fan of the Into the Spider-Verse films, one of the things that the animators did for that was Miles Morales in that film moved at 12 frames per second while Peter B. Parker moved at 24 to allow the fluidity and the finesse to which Peter B. moved to show the difference between him and Miles succinctly as different Spider-Men. And there was a couple times in this show where the movement just doesn't necessarily feel fluid. And any time we see a two-dimensional image rendered of these character models, we see that in the intro, which is a really fun way of using the 60s Spider-Man theme. But as an example, Peter Parker's ID badge is his character model in 2 dimensions because it's a photo. I think the character models for everybody are amazing. And I know I've said this already, but these things go hand in hand. The CG action of it all is really great, particularly the way that they choreograph Spider-Man and the camera following him through a 3D world, so it feels significantly more immersive. When these characters are standing still, there's absolutely no reason for them to be 3D, and given the fact that they don't have the additional textures that something like Into the Spider-Verse had, it's going to definitely take me time to adjust. The first episode felt substantially more rough, but then because this is a 2-episode premiere, I found myself caring a lot less about that. And I know this is probably similar sounding to how I discussed the first 2 episodes of Creature Commandos. We know that this is going to have a substantial amount of episodes. I want to say that it's 10. Yeah, it has a 10-episode run. I'm sure I'm not going to be thinking about that whatsoever by the end of it. Elements of this that I really like from the story, because we've gotten 2 episodes, about 42 to 44 minutes of story establishing Peter's world. We see that he's supposed to go to Midtown, and with a symbiotic alien fight with Doctor Strange, it destroys Midtown, so he goes to another school. And the dynamic of having a modernized high school experience, now it's been a significantly long time since I was in high school, it feels in a line with what we did see from the John Hughes-esque elements of Spider-Man Homecoming. But again, we're having characters like Luna Snow, who was obviously not a part of the film. We don't have Ned. We don't have Michelle Jones. We have Lonnie Lincoln as a cast member. And one of Peter's major saves that he does have as Spider-Man is of Harry Osborn, and then I obviously have mentioned already how he meets Norman Osborn, but that dynamic setting up, if you were a longtime Spider-Man fan, knowing Norman's not a good guy, and he obviously does a substantial amount of shady things, how's that relationship going to be explored? And obviously, if you did watch episode 2, you know where this is going, but I don't really want to talk about that yet, so I'll continue talking mainly about episode 1, and establishing this element of Peter still having such a distinct separation, where this version of Peter is very much that nerdy, ill-fitted confidence person who really has to be pushed in the direction of doing things like asking out the girl with his friend that he does have, the one friend that he currently does have being Luna. Harry hasn't shown up at the school yet. I'm assuming, of course, they're going to have some sort of friendship, as Harry Osborn and Peter Parker normally do. But continuing to expand the cast of this show, with Lonnie being somebody who clearly is from the rougher area of New York, and Lonnie Lincoln eventually going to be some form of tombstone, I'm curious about. One of the things that's interesting about putting characters who are typically adults as students at the school is this does have similar elements and vibes to Iron Man Armored Adventures, which did make Tony Stark a young man, or a young guy, or he was a teenager. I don't know why I'm having a hard time saying that, as opposed to an adult when everything else happened to him. So that was something that I felt reminded of while watching this. And episode 2 is interesting because one of the main focuses of Marvel's Spider-Man, which came out in 2017, was really focusing on the scientific part of being Spider-Man. Peter Parker is a brilliant scientist. Let's really lean into that. They had the scientific academy, and a lot of the powers and villains came from this scientific background, as opposed to random experiments maybe in Spectacular Spider-Man, they were all Oscorp related, or in the the Spider-Man the Animated Series, they were all a lot of freak accidents, as they typically are in the Spider-Man lore. This show also has that, where we see Norman Osborn recruiting Peter Parker to bring him to Oscorp for an internship, and there is a group of other students who are also working there on projects with other characters. We have Amadeus Cho, who will eventually maybe turn into a Hulk. We have Asha, who's from Wakanda. And then we also have Jean Foucault, who is somebody I'm not necessarily familiar with, but winds up being Finesse, which is a character that I am not familiar with whatsoever. So we also have that similar element of establishing the science being such an important part of Peter Parker's character. Of course, given where we see Peter's costume in this, it's very reminiscent of what was teased in Captain America Civil War, but wasn't necessarily revealed. And then, of course, we did get in Spider-Man Homecoming his costume that he created, or potentially version 2, which was much more Ben Reilly connected in terms of its influence. And this show, we have a Spider-Man that is, because it's so young, or he is so fresh into being Spider-Man, only having done this for a couple months, we have a lot of things you wouldn't necessarily think of, like he has gas canisters, which would power the PSI that would be responsible and connected to him using actual web shooting, which I thought was really cool. And him being at Oscorp, how is his availability to tech going to help him modernize and update his costume, potentially similar to an Iron Man, where we are going to have Mark 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and eventually some version of the future Foundation suit, which of course I didn't react necessarily positively to when I did watch the trailer for this show. One of the elements that I found particularly interesting, especially because I'm reading the newest run of Ultimate Spider-Man, is it is revealed at the end of episode 2 that Norman Osborn has footage of Peter Parker becoming Spider-Man to go and help fight something. This dynamic is a substantial storyline in Ultimate Spider-Man, as opposed to being Norman, it's Harry Osborn. Essentially, from the get-go, they know who each other is, and there's this relationship where Green Goblin, for now we're, I believe, only 14 issues in at this point as of recording, Harry is a hero. Are we going to get a version of the Green Goblin in this show that is a hero for Peter Parker before he becomes the Green Goblin that we all know and hate? I'm really curious about that, particularly because obviously in the MCU, we never did get their version of the Green Goblin. We got Willem Dafoe's version of the Green Goblin, and Coleman Domingo as that character is something I'm really hoping happens, particularly because we didn't get the MCU versions of any of those characters, and there has been guessing online that potentially we might get Coleman Domingo in the Marvel Cinematic Universe because of all the dimensional stuff. None of the Osborns have ever been referenced, and this allows this show to be different from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Also, we do know from the trailers we are going to be getting other characters that have had interpretations in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as an example being the Daredevil characters. Vincent D'Onofrio and Charlie Cox coming back to voice them as well, and we're likely going to get, again, a lot of this is going to be skewed slightly differently from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but outside of the setup for this, this clearly is its own universe, and as the show goes on, I'm assuming, just from my own standpoint, I will continually stop thinking about the Marvel Cinematic Universe and just watch this show for what it is, which is, I'm assuming, based on why they changed the creative process for this, what everybody should be looking forward to, which is Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man is its own thing, similar to so many other Spider-Man shows that just focused on being their own show. 2 episodes into this, I'm completely sold on what this universe is. I'm really looking forward to seeing this version of a lot of the characters that we may have never seen in the MCU. And the more I watch it, I want to think about the MCU less. I think it's a really good starting point, the first 2, putting all of the pieces in place, and the story's now going to have the opportunity to unfold throughout the remaining 8. I believe the episode release order is in chunks, which from a streaming standpoint, I appreciate. I know Rob Keyes, friend of the show, of course, appreciates it when the thing is dropped all at once, allowing the viewer to pick how they watch it. But as somebody who only has so much time, I'm going to watch this episode in chunks as it's released. And I'm glad that I can do that and didn't have to watch it all at once and have less of it have an impact. That's a terrible sentence. I apologize. I'm recording this late on Sunday evening. If you did watch Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, let me know what you thought about it. You can comment on Spotify, on YouTube, or you can tag me in any of the social media stuff. Now let's jump into listener mail and question of the week responses.
Can I ask you a question? Just fun?
There's something I've been meaning to ask you.
I ask the questions, you answer the questions.
Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers?
Did that count as a question?
Yes.
Damn it.
Last week's question of the week was, what is your favorite version of vampires in pop culture? Baron Candy 3939 said, Hellsing, the anime, was one of my proper intros into vampires, and man, that owned. I've never heard of this, so it's something I'm looking forward to into watching later. Geigertron 3000 said 30 Days of Night. Okay, I think that's a movie, but I've never seen it. And then Jonathan Chavez 7333 or 7,333 said Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I'm assuming, Jonathan, you mean the television series. I know some people love the cult classic film, but I'm assuming you mean the show, given how long it ran for and its spin-offs as well. Scotty Cameron, welcome back, Scotty, said Vampire's Kiss. Just kidding. It's a funny movie to watch before you die. Oh, interesting, is it? But my real answer is probably a bit niche because it's The Batman versus Dracula. I love that movie, Scotty. I think The Batman is an underrated series because of when it released, it being during Justice League and being its own distinct universe. I know some people want to have them against each other or compare them. They do such different things. And Batman versus Dracula, I mean, how can you not love that? Dylan Pollock writes in, lol, you had to leave in Star Shoes. Yes, I did. That's what you said, Dylan, so I left it in. I guess it's Blade because some always trying to ice skate uphill. It's a great tagline. I don't think it should have been in Deadpool and Wolverine, though, because when has Blade ever been meta? The answer, he never has. And then Sparago Castano said, so many great options to choose between. I can't select just one. The Underworld series and the Blade series are my top 2 favorites. I'm absolutely shocked by this, but nobody wrote in with Twilight, True Blood, Vampire Diaries. I'm sure there's some I'm not thinking of, but I really appreciate that because I was assuming as much, people still gave a wide variety of choices for their answers for this, which I'm grateful for because it gives a wide variety of things to talk about and gives things for me to add to my list of stuff I've never seen. So I really appreciate everybody who wrote into last week's question of the week. Now, I'm curious because obviously I'm talking about Spider-Man, but the show's going to continually air for at least 2 or 3 more weeks. So there's going to be some more Spider-Man chatter, but with Captain America 4 coming out in the next couple weeks, 2 weeks from when you're listening to this, I would love to know, what is your favorite Marvel trilogy? Now, it can be within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or it can be outside of that, but there have been so many that I'm really curious to see if somebody has a distinct one that they obviously think is better than anything from there. There have been multiple X-Men trilogies that you could include as your favorite Marvel trilogy. Captain America 4 may be the start of a new one, or it could be a one-off. There is a reason that Marvel, after Iron Man, decided to stop giving numbers to their films because they didn't want to have it associated with a prior movie, even though they were sequels. This is also kind of why the last Mission Impossible is now called Mission Impossible Final Reckoning and not Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 2. Or, to be more connected to Spider-Man, why it was called Across the Spider-Verse, and the third film, which, man, I hope that comes out in a reasonable time frame was called Spider-Man Beyond the Spider, or will be called Spider-Man Beyond the Spider-Verse. Thank you to everybody who listened to this episode. If this is your first time, please consider giving the podcast a 5-star review on your preferred podcast platform. The podcast is evolving. We're doing great. More people are listening. I'm seeing those ratings come through, which I really greatly appreciate. It allows the podcast to get to the next level. I may have achieved that to some degree, but you're going to have to wait for me to announce that in the next couple weeks because I don't want to spoil it on this week's episode. But I can tell you, next week's episode of the podcast will be a review of Ke Huy Quan's action movie, Love Hurts. I hope it's amazing. I want it to be everything the trailers make it seem to be, which is wildly entertaining and have a charismatic Oscar-winning lead continue to kick butt, which it looks like it will be. It's coming from 87 North, who knows how to make these movies. Mr. Nobody, Bullet Train, Atomic Blonde. The list goes on. I'm really looking forward to that, so that will be next week's episode. I may have a guest, I may not. If you tune into the next week's episode, it's because you want to be there, not because of who's joining me. My name is Kyle Naranya, and I will see you next time.